Looking for an all-inclusive set of RimWorld beginner's guides that'll teach you everything you need to know to hit the ground running? Well, buckle up, you're in the right place. Hey there, my name is Salendrak and welcome to my comprehensive beginner's guide for RimWorld, the surprisingly addictive storytelling colony simulator by indie developer Ludion Studios. These guides are intended for players who are completely new to RimWorld, coming back after a long hiatus, or otherwise struggling to make it through the game, and will cover topics ranging from game settings, mods, starting pawn selection, base planning, and all sorts of important game mechanics. There will be 3 episodes, and here's a table of contents showing the topics covered in each video, so feel free to hop around as needed, and links are down in the description. The first video covers new world settings, storyteller AIs, and difficulty levels, and discusses a straightforward approach to starting pawn selection. The second installment is primarily focused on planning out your base, including the types of rooms and outdoor areas you'll want to include, but will also cover topics including mood, drugs, storage, and how to set up workstation builds for crafting. And finally, the third video will put everything into practice, demonstrating lots of gameplay, and will include discussions about setting work priorities, review combat mechanics including friendly fire, armor and clothing, base security, and wealth management. As with all my guides, timestamps are down in the description in case you need to come back later to brush up on a specific topic, as are links to the other videos in the series and some fabulous in-depth guides about various topics by other great content creators. And please let me know down in the comments if you would like me to do more guides on this absolute gem of a game. Now let's get to it! RimWorld officially released back in 2018 after having been in development for upwards of 5 years, and has since had 2 major expansions released, Royalty and Ideology. These guides will only be focusing on the base game with neither of the expansions enabled, which is where you'll likely want to start out if you're new to the game, as each expansion adds a whole lot of additional complexity that you probably won't want to deal with when just learning the basics. Now, before we start talking about game settings and whatnot, I do want to talk a little bit about mods. As with many games these days, RimWorld has a robust modding community, with offerings that range from minor tweaks to full-on overhauls of the entire game. And while there's nothing wrong with playing the game without any mods, if you're like me, you might quickly find that the vanilla game has certain aspects that are cumbersome, annoying, or that just don't make a lot of sense in the overall context of the game, but can be fixed with a few simple mods. And in the interest of full disclosure, here's a list of some of the mods that I personally can't live without and do recommend even if you are brand new to the game, though it is of course completely optional. I'll probably do a separate video later on talking about these and other mods you may want to consider, but if you are interested in any of the mods listed here, check the video description for more information, as well as links to their respective pages on the Steam Workshop. For now though, just know that if things look different in my game than they do in yours, it's because of one or more of these mods. One other point I want to make before we get going is that RimWorld gets updates pretty regularly. This video has current information as of the 1.3.3287 version of the game, and I'll try to post updates down in a pinned comment if any big changes happen. Now let's go over the various new game options so you'll understand what all is available and why you'll probably want to start out with certain options selected. Do note that the game has a nice little tutorial that will teach you a few of the basics, so be sure to do that if you are truly brand new to the game. But what I'm going to be teaching you throughout these guides is much more expansive. When you first click the New Colony button, you'll be presented with a choice of 4 different scenarios that will determine what all you start with in a new world. The best pick for first game is definitely the top choice, Crash Landed, which is the de facto classic RimWorld experience. It starts you out with 3 colonists, a pet, and a nice mix of starting materials and equipment. You'll also have access to several early game technologies that will help you get a good colony up and running fast. Feel free to read through the descriptions of the other scenarios, and I highly recommend trying them out at some point. After selecting the next button, you then get to choose an AI storyteller. Now, the choice of storyteller, as well as the difficulty level, will have a huge impact on what your game will be like. The role of the storyteller is to throw events at you. These events can be good, like potential recruits or useful resources literally falling from the sky. They can be bad, like a colonist getting sick or a solar flare knocking out your electrical grid. Or they can be really bad, like raids from other factions, as well as mechanoid events and insect infestations. In general, the severity of events, particularly on the bad side of the scale, will ramp up over time as your colony gets a larger population and more wealthy. Both Cassandra Classic and Phoebe Chillax will tend to throw events at you on a fairly regular schedule, and bad events will generally be followed with some breathing room to recover before the next bad thing happens, with the cooldown period being shorter with Cassandra and quite a bit longer with Phoebe. Randy Random, on the other hand, is completely random and will basically throw whatever he wants at you whenever he wants. If you're lucky, you can go long stretches with nothing bad happening, but if you're unlucky, you might get back-to-back raids and other nasty events that might make survival extremely difficult, if not impossible. I personally prefer to use either Cassandra or Randy, as the events really are the spice of life in this game. Because Phoebe goes on vacation on a regular basis, games with her as the storyteller can sometimes be a bit boring, while she can also sometimes lull you into a false sense of security and then hit you with an oversized raid that you weren't expecting because you let your wealth get too high during an extended calm spell. For a new player, I would recommend that you just go with Cassandra, as she'll give you a more consistent experience over the course of the game and will also tend to give you some time to recover if you don't do so well against a particular challenge. But do feel free to experiment with the other storytellers as you get more experience in the game. As for difficulty level, if you're a new player, I recommend that you set it to either Adventure Story or Strive to Survive. The easier difficulty levels of Peaceful and Community Builder have certain types of events turned off entirely, so you won't be able to experience everything the game can potentially throw at you. But on Adventure Story, every event is active, but the likelihood of some bad events is turned down a little bit. Strive to Survive, on the other hand, is the default difficulty level for the game, while the higher levels just get harder and harder. As for the bottom two options, definitely go with Reload Anytime for your first few games. Commitment mode is basically the game's hardcore mode, where you're stuck with whatever mistakes you might make and can never reload to an earlier save of your game. But there's no need to punish yourself when you're just learning to play, and trying different tactics to, for example, handle a particular raid is a great way to learn how to manage the game's various challenges. Also note that you can change these storyteller and difficulty settings midstream in a game simply by going to the options menu and selecting storyteller options at the bottom middle of the window. For this guide, I'll be using Cassandra on Strive to Survive and Reload Anytime. Once you hit next, you'll arrive at the Create World screen, and there are a few options to review here. The right side of the screen shows how many of each of the different types of factions will be on the planet. Outlander unions and pirate gangs are technologically advanced, while the tribes are more primitive. The civil Outlanders and gentle tribes start out neutral and will periodically send visitors and trade caravans to your colony. You can also send caravans to their outposts to trade goods, and if you're nice to them, then over time you can improve your reputation and become allies, which will allow you to request trade caravans and even military assistance. The rough Outlanders and fierce tribes, on the other hand, are hostile to you by default, cannot be traded with, and will send raiding parties to attack you. It is possible to improve your reputation with them to the point you can trade or even become allies, but this is difficult as over time their reputation will move back towards being hostile. The pirates and savage tribes are always hostile, so don't even try to make friends with them. Because there will be multiple outposts of each faction scattered throughout the world, there's really no need to have more than one of each type of faction in the world, as it will just dilute your ability to improve relations with any given faction. As for mechanoid hives and insect gene lines, these things will cause problems later on in a game, and for a first world I would definitely leave them active, though if you find you don't like their particular types of events, you can always turn them off in future worlds by hitting the minus button and setting them to 0. Seed can just be totally random or whatever you want to put in, and for globe coverage, this generally should be kept at its default 30% or maybe up to 50%. You'll be spending the vast majority of your time in your colony's settled tile, and sending caravans to trade or do quests in the surrounding areas. The only time a bigger world really makes a difference is if, as one of the victory condition options, you decide to travel to a distant location to find a dormant starship to escape from the planet. And on a larger world setting, that can lead to a really long journey. So there's really no benefit to a bigger world, only a potential downside. And I say that's an optional victory condition because you can also just stay put and build your own starship, or may prefer to never leave the planet and try to survive as long as possible. As for rainfall, temperature, and population, I always just leave those on default, and for this world I'll be using the seed Salandrak with 50% globe coverage. Once you hit Generate World, the planet will be created and then you'll see your new home in all its glory. You can move the world around using your WASD keys and can zoom in and out with the mouse wheel or page up and page down buttons on your keyboard. The main task here is to pick the starting tile for your new home, but first it's worth mentioning a few of the options that are in the advanced button down at the bottom. For map size, the game is balanced around the medium values, and it will actually caution you away from the large sizes. Small maps will feel really cramped, so just stick with either of the medium sizes, and I tend to prefer the larger of the two. Starting season should also be left on auto, which will generally have you landing on the planet at the start of your selected tile's growing season. Now let's talk about the features of the world. Like any good Class M planet, it has a variety of different biomes and will be warmer near the equator and colder near the poles. For a first game, the general recommendation is to pick a temperate forest tile that has either large or small hills and a growing season that is at least 40 days or more of the 60-day year to ensure you'll have plenty of time to grow some crops, with the year-round growing season being the easiest. For detailed information about any tile, be sure to toggle open the terrain button at the bottom left. Temperate forests are nice because their temperature ranges aren't too bad to handle, and you'll have plenty of growing trees, berries, and heal root, and lots of animals you'll be able to hunt and or tame. Hills are nice to have because you'll have plenty of resources that can be mined, and depending on the layout, the hills may form natural barriers and choke points for defense against future raids. By contrast, the darker green swamp and rainforest tiles will have lots of dense underbrush that will slow down movement and be time consuming to clear, and diseases and dangerous wildlife will be more common. They'll also have lots of muddy areas where you won't be able to build for much of the game. The light brown and arid shrublands and deserts, on the other hand, will have sparse vegetation and animal life and can have extreme temperatures of hot, cold, or both. As you near the poles, you'll start to find boreal forests and tundra, where the average temperatures and growing seasons get lower and lower, and on the extreme poles, you'll find ice sheets and sea ice, the harshest climates on the planet, where generally only masochistic RimWorld veterans dare tread. And for future reference, here's a nice graphic from the wiki showing the relative difficulty of the various biomes. As for flat and mountainous areas, flat terrain is generally lacking in mineral resources and natural defensive features, while mountains will lack open areas for building a base unless you do lots of digging first, which can lead to insect infestations later in the game and can be a pain to deal with. So for now, just stick with a temperate forest and large or small hills, and it's a good idea to pick a spot that is somewhat close to a neutral tribe and or outlander union for future trade opportunities. The game will warn you if you're too close though, as they'll view it as an encroachment on their territory. Close proximity to a road can also be nice to speed up travel. It's worth mentioning at this point that each tile will have 2 or 3 types of stone present, which will be important building materials for walls, floors, and other items. Granite makes the strongest types of stone walls and can be nice to have, while marble has inherent beauty and is great for making beautiful sculptures, furniture, and buildings. For the most part though, you really don't need to worry too much about the type of stone present, so if you find a good spot, just go with it, though finding a good spot with granite and marble certainly doesn't hurt. I'll also mention that for now it's probably best to avoid any tiles that have caves as a special feature. Although the caves can have harvestable mushrooms, they can also sometimes have insect hives, which will just be an added danger that you probably won't want to deal with as you're learning the game. For this world, I've picked a nice temperate forest with a year-round growing season, small hills with marble and granite stone types, and nearby outposts for the friendly outlanders and tribals with roads to travel on. Once you've picked a tile that has a location and features that appeal to you, hit next, and it's time to pick your starting pawns. Picking good starting pawns is quite important and will go a long way in determining your likelihood of early game success. On the left side of the screen, you'll have 8 characters from which you'll be able to pick the top 3 that will be the pawns you'll actually start with. If any pawns are truly terrible, you can simply hit the randomize button and they'll be completely re-rolled, and generally speaking, you'll probably spend at least some time re-rolling these guys to get an adequate starting team. In general, I like to re-roll pawns until I have 3 starter pawns that don't have any disqualifying traits and do have certain specific skills that they're either decent at, meaning a skill of 6 or more, or that they have passion for, which is indicated by the flame symbols next to the skill. Skill level is important in RimWorld, as there are all sorts of jobs and tasks that will need to be performed. Higher skilled pawns will get those jobs done faster and with higher resource yields or success rates, while lower skilled pawns will be slower and more prone to failure, which results in lost time and wasted resources. And although having a good skill level is important, even more important is having an interest or passion in the skill. Pawns with an interest in a skill or a single flame next to it will learn that skill at 100% speed when performing related jobs, while pawns with no flames will learn at only 35% speed, so quite a bit slower. With 2 flames, they'll learn at 150% speed. Additionally, interested pawns will gain a +8 mood bonus when performing jobs that require that skill, and if they're passionate, they'll get a +14 mood buff. And because the amount of experience needed to advance is pretty low at low skill levels, an interested or passionate worker with a low starting skill will speed through those early levels quite quickly, and before you know it will be quite competent at those tasks. Now, of the 12 total skills in the game, some are more important than others for your starting characters. The artistic skill is one you can entirely ignore for your starter pawns. Yes, it can be nice later on for beautifying rooms or selling works of art to trade caravans, but in the early game it is completely unnecessary. The skills you'll definitely want to have, though, are shooting, melee, construction, medical, social, and intellectual. And by have, I mean at least one of your pawns will have a skill level of 6 or higher, or be interested or passionate for even if their starting skill is low, though of course 1 or 2 flame symbols and a high skill level is even better. The other skills, namely mining, cooking, plants, animals, and crafting, are nice to have, and you'll definitely want starter pawns that aren't totally incapable of those jobs, but they aren't quite as critical as the ones I mentioned earlier, and here's why. Good shooting and melee skills are needed to defend your colony from raids and manhunter animals, which will start to attack you sooner or later. A good shooter will also be able to hunt animals that will be plentiful in a temperate forest in order to provide food for your colonists and hides that can be used to make clothing and other items. Consequently, you technically don't need to have anyone particularly good at growing plants, as even low-skilled characters can plant and harvest basic crops, as well as forage for berries that grow naturally on the map. Later on, you will want to have a passionate planter as your dedicated gardener, but for starting out, you don't really need that skill too much. Similarly, although a good cook is certainly desirable, a perfectly viable option, especially in the early game, is the nutrient paste dispenser. Eating this stuff will give pawns a small mood penalty, but it's pretty minor and far better than getting food poisoning from meals prepared by an incompetent chef. Mining is another skill that can be nice to have early on, but isn't critical in the early game. Even low-skilled miners can still mine anything that needs to be mined, they'll just do it slower and have slightly lower yields, so like plants, this isn't a critical skill to have from the get-go. Similarly, crafting is nice to have, as even in the early game you'll need to start making clothes and basic weapons pretty soon, but you can generally make do in the early game with no particularly skilled crafters and recruit or otherwise acquire one later on. Animals likewise isn't terribly important in the early game, as it can be rather time and resource intensive to train and care for animals, and you'll have other higher priorities as you get your colony built up. Medical, on the other hand, is super important, as your colonists will regularly get injured in fights and fall victim to diseases and infections, which will make their survival rates very poor if you don't have a decent doctor around. The social skill is another one that is super useful to have amongst your starter pawns, as it will greatly contribute to your ability to recruit prisoners to join your colony, as well as getting good deals from trade caravans. Construction is also pretty important early on, as you'll be building lots of structures and furniture in order to take care of the basic needs of your colony, and intellectual is important as it will determine how quickly you can unlock new technologies in order to progress through the game. So with that understanding of what skills are more or less important to have, here's how I like to roll my starters. The first pawn I like to get locked into place is a good medical intellectual character that is also decent at one or two other lower priority skills such as cooking, crafting, animals, or plants. To do that, I just spam the randomize button until I see either high skill values or one or two flames on the medical and intellectual lines, and then look to see if there are other jobs they'll be decent at doing. If those boxes get checked, I'll then look to see if they have any disqualifying features, which might be age, health conditions, or particularly bad traits. And along the lines of disqualifying features, here are 4 general rules to keep in mind when determining whether to keep a character that has good skills or keep hitting the randomize button. Just don't spend hours on this screen trying to get the perfect team. After all, learning how to manage your character's various quirks and limitations is half the fun of the game. Disqualification rule number 1, avoid characters that are too old. As pawns get older, they become more and more likely to develop debilitating illnesses, so it's generally best to start with team members that aren't older than about 50, the younger the better. On the flip side, characters that are still teenagers will only have a childhood backstory and won't have an adult one. These backstories can greatly impact their starting skills and traits, so teenagers generally won't be as good as adults, but if you get a good one, don't get rid of them just because they're really young. And if a character is otherwise fantastic but for being too old, they still might be worth picking up, though I would probably avoid anyone that is on the upper end of the age scale of 60 or above. Disqualification rule number 2, avoid bad health conditions and absolutely avoid chemical addictions for your starter pawns. There's a wide variety of health conditions a pawn might start with, and I would generally avoid anything that will cause them to move or work slowly, such as a bad back or missing limbs. Chemical addictions can be extremely difficult to deal with, particularly in the early game, and should be avoided entirely. Old wounds and scars generally aren't too bad to deal with though, but anything with more than a few pain percentage points should be avoided, as it will be a constant drain on a pawn's mood. Disqualification rule number 3, avoid particularly troublesome negative traits. In general, it's more important to not have certain bad traits than it is to have any particular good traits, as many traits are two-sided coins that have both positive and negative effects. But some of the worst that you'll probably want to avoid, especially for your starting pawns, are the following: pyromaniac, chemical interest or fascination, and anything that has strong and permanent negative mood or work speed effects, such as depressive, volatile, or very neurotic for mood, and slothful or lazy for work speed. Pyromaniac is mostly just annoying because such pawns will randomly go on fire starting sprees, and done at the wrong place or at the wrong time can be devastating. Similarly, any pawn with chemical interest or fascination will sometimes go on drug-using binges that can quickly lead to addictions and other problems, not to mention deplete your stockpiles that are useful for trade and short-term mood boosting. Later on in the game, these pawns can be managed, but in the early game without chemicals, they'll just be grumpy all the time. I would also try to avoid wimpy and sickly for my starter pawns, as having them go out of commission during a fight or getting sick all the time can be really problematic when your colony is just getting started. And finally, disqualification rule number 4, try to avoid starter pawns that are incapable of violence, dumb labor, or firefighting. Having individual pawns that are incapable of doing certain jobs is generally fine, so long as one or two other pawns can do that job well. But in the early game, it can really hurt if one of your 3 pawns can't help out when lots of stuff needs to be hauled, if fires need to get put out, or you need to defend yourself from an attack. I'll briefly mention that it's pretty common to have relationships between the starting selection of pawns, but I generally ignore this field unless I think it would be funny to start with pawns that have a history with each other. Overall though, it's generally not a factor to which I put any weight. Now getting back to our medical intellectual, here are a few examples of good pawns that would fit this description. Morgan here is passionate and very skilled at medical, interested in both plants and intellectual, and decent at a whole lot of other stuff with nothing she's incapable of. She has no health issues or relationships, and although she's a bit older than I would normally like, she's also super immune, so if she does get sick, she'll recover a lot faster, which is a great trait to have, especially on a doctor. The bloodlust and brawler traits are fine, though with her low fighting skills combined with the fact that she's a good doctor, I probably won't be putting her on the front lines anyways. All things considered, a pretty decent choice. Next we have Froy, who is also passionate and skilled at medical, and interested and decent at intellectual as well as plants. He's not good at anything else, but he's also not incapable of anything, but at least he has an interest in animals and crafting that will level up pretty fast. Decent age of 39 with no health issues, his creepy breathing and misogynist traits will make it hard for him to make friends, which can lead to some negative mood debuffs, but all things considered should fit his role pretty well. And finally we've got Max, who is actually an example of someone I probably would re-roll and not start out with. Although he's decently skilled at medical and intellectual and also passionate about animals and social and a decent melee fighter, he's also incapable of lots of stuff, and his Goreman trait can be a bit annoying, especially for a starter pawn. Great memory is fine, and Cannibal is, well, something you can play with, but overall is just not my style. But Froy or Morgan would both be fine, and of the two, I'm actually going to start the game with Morgan for her mixed jack-of-all-trades skill levels. Once I've got my medical intellectual, the next pawn I'll get locked into place is a shooting construction character that also has decent skill in something else, and ideally something the first pawn doesn't already take care of. And once I've got a good pawn for the second role, the third pawn will ideally also be good at shooting and or melee, while decent at any important skills I might still be lacking in order to round out the team. With all those considerations in mind, here are two examples of decent starting teams I would be happy to start with in a crash-landed scenario. In example number 1, we've got Todd, Shorty, and Seraph. Todd is my medical intellectual who is also decent at cooking and crafting with an interest in each, as well as an interest in plants and social. He has a scratch scar on his right arm which will decrease his work speed a little bit, but at least it doesn't cause him any pain. He's decently young at 29 years old, isn't incapable of anything even though he's terrible at several skills, and he has an interesting but not problematic mix of traits. Careful shooter doesn't do him much good since he's a terrible shot anyways, and tough with Wimpy is actually pretty funny. Tough means he'll take less damage from combat and be hard to kill, but Wimpy means he'll get down from pain really fast. All things considered, as my top doctor, I'll be sure to keep him off the front lines as much as possible, and he'll be a great in-base character. Shorty, on the other hand, is a crack soldier with moderate shooting and melee skills for which he is passionate about both. He's not very good at anything else, but his interest in construction and mining will make him useful, and he'll otherwise make a good hunter. With a cooking skill of only 3, I wouldn't want him to make meals anytime soon, but he can be the primary butcher of animals he hunts, which will give him cooking experience. At 24 years old, he's nice and young, and he has no health issues. He's incapable of social, which is fine, and his psychopath and 2 smart traits are some of those 2-sided coins I mentioned earlier. Psychopath means he won't be bothered by events that normally hurt the mood of others, but he won't get any benefit from social interactions. Too smart means he'll learn everything he does faster, though he will be at slightly increased risk for mental breaks. All things considered though, a pretty solid starter pawn. And finally, rounding out the party is Seraph, who, like Shorty, is also a crack soldier with an interest in construction, but he is also decent at social and has an interest in plants. A young 23 with no health issues, he can't do mining or artistic jobs, which is perfectly fine, but he's staggeringly ugly, which is kind of funny for a social guy. This will make it more likely that he'll have negative interactions with other pawns and make it difficult for him to have romantic relationships, but will otherwise be a manageable downside. Aesthetic is likewise both a positive and a negative. You just need to make sure he has a basic bedroom and isn't fed any lavish meals. Nimble, on the other hand, is a great trait, as it will make him even more effective in combat. So yeah, that makes a pretty good starter team. Here's another example of a good team, and is the one I'll actually be using primarily for these guides. To start off, we've got Morgan from earlier as our medical intellectual, who can also garden and get other stuff done and will probably do okay in melee combat if needed. Next, for a shooter construction character, we've got Engie, who's passionate about shooting and has 8 skill in construction, which was more than good enough for initial base building. She's also very good and passionate about crafting, and can be a backup doctor if Morgan is out of commission. Her torso scratch causes a little bit of pain, but will be manageable, and like Morgan, she's a bit older than I would normally like. However, the fast walker trait is really nice, especially for a character that will likely be doing lots of hunting, and the greedy trait is also pretty manageable. And rounding out the team, we've got Trumpet, who will be a decent fighter and builder, and is both passionate and very skilled at social. He's not capable of providing medical care, but since the other 2 pawns are decent doctors, that's perfectly fine. He's a nice age of 34, has no health issues, and both his traits are very good. Sanguine gives him a permanent plus 12 mood buff, and the kind trait means he'll get along with others and provide mood buffs to them as well. Overall, this team hits all the most important boxes, although with no good cooks, they'll have to rely on nutrient paste until they find a resident chef. The team's mining and animal skills are also mediocre, but I can make do without those in the early game as everything else is well covered. Once you're satisfied with your starter pawns, go ahead and hit start, read the introductory scenario text, then hit OK and watch your characters crash land onto the planet. At this point, you'll want to immediately pause the game, as there are a lot of things you'll want to do before you actually start playing, such as look around your map, plan your future building locations, and set up your work priorities, all of which and more we'll go over in parts 2 and 3 of the guides. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!